Welcome everybody. This is my session on the NSF ODP tooling, which is as I'll get into it a little bit more. It's a not charmingly named project of mine on OpenNTF that has to do with building NSFs, and it will apply to developers and to a certain extent admins alike. I'll start with a little bit of introductions. So my name is Jesse Gallagher. I wear a good number of hats. One of them is that I'm the CTO of I Know Some Guys, which is a consulting contracting company outside of Philadelphia in the US here. I am also the IP manager for OpenNTF, so that when somebody submits something, I'm the one who goes through and says, do you have all of your licensing ducks in a row, so that when somebody then uses that project, they will not be sued into bankruptcy. The best places to see what I write, if you end up so inclined, are at my blog at frostilic.us and then at Gidgerby on Twitter. But before I fully get into my presentation, I would like to thank the sponsors of this conference. So, even though it's not in person, putting on this conference is no small feat, and it is not a free thing. And so, thank you to the sponsors, and in particular, thank you to Richard Moy, where it is, especially as he's in a position where his power is going out during the OGS, he is probably an extremely stressed person, and I would like to express my appreciation for all the work he always does with all of this. So on to the NSF ODP tooling. So what is it? In broad strokes, it's a set of Maven and Eclipse plugins for working with on-disk projects. So in this case, on-disk project is the term that Designer uses and is commonly used for the text-based representation of an NSF. So if you've used the source control enablement, as it used to be called, or it's the team development in Designer, this is when you take an NSF and then say, I want to sync this to a file system project. That is the on-disk project. And so what this has to do is ways to work with that project outside of Designer, and in a good couple of ways it adds some enhancements. So the distinction is there's the NSF, essentially I'll refer to it as compiled, but that's what developers normally work with on Domino. And there's the on-disk project version of it. So that's the DXL files and the XSP as a text file in the file system, and so forth. It has four main components. So there's the ODP to NSF compiler. So that's taking the on-disk project and turning it into an NSF. So this is equivalent to in Designer, where you right-click on a project and then say team development associate with new NSF, where you have these files, say you got it from a GitHub project or elsewhere, and you want to turn it into an NSF. This project is a re-implementation of that does not use Designer, that will take that and then take that ODP, spit on an NSF as if it had gone through that. Why this is interesting, I will get into later. The other side of it is NSF to ODP. So this is the reverse of it. So similarly in Designer, if you take an NSF and say associate with a new on-disk project, it will create those files on the file system. Part of this project is that, again, without Designer. Some deployment support. The idea here is that at the end or in an automated way, you can deploy an NSF. So this is an equivalent to in Notes or in Designer, where you'd say refresh design, or in particular replace design. So the idea is that this is a way where you can do that part of it either just without Designer or in an automated way, which will come into the CD of the CI/CD, which is continuous integration, continuous development, or delivery or deployment. And then there's a set of Eclipse UI extensions. So these are things that if you're using Eclipse like I do, most of my development happens in the Eclipse IDE on the Mac. So these extensions will make that better. So I'll show those a little bit, where these are kind of like niceties on top, where you're not working in Designer, but you still want to do some editing of design elements, XPages or not. There's some enhancements to Eclipse to help you do that. So further, what is it? One big one is no requirement for Designer. So I use a Mac. A lot of other people do. A lot of people use Linux. Designer is not available for that. And then even when you're on Windows, Designer is bad. So it's good to not have to use Designer. So we had a couple projects like this where Christian Gudeman did a great job with one a while ago, because back in the IBM days, they added the ability to compile an on-disk project automatically. So the idea there would be that it would be headless Designer, and then it would compile it. But that had a lot of requirements, and it was extremely fiddly due to the way Designer worked. And I said, when I set this out, I don't want to have Designer. So all of this stuff will run on any OS that can run Java, essentially. So it does not have a requirement for Designer. It will work with a local Notes Domino runtime or remote server. The implications of this vary a little bit, but the idea is that if you have, like I do, I have Notes installed on my Mac, and I use Eclipse, and I use this tooling, and this all works with that. So that Notes runtime is there. However, I can also point at a remote server. And again, this will make a little more sense in a bit, but I can say, okay, well, I have a Domino server sitting somewhere on at my company or on a VM, and I can work here and not have a requirement to have Notes installed if I don't want to. So in theory, you could be doing all of your Domino development on a Raspberry Pi because you could. So the local runtime would work with Mac OS, Windows, or Linux on x86 or x86 64. And remote runtime is anything that runs Java. So this is designed to, and this is like sort of a little buzzwordy version of it, designed to allow clean, consistent builds without UI interaction. So again, the problem, with Designer is that you have, you as a user are using Designer and you perform actions in the UI. And then even with the headless Designer, it'll kind of show up in the UI and it's weird and it ends up strange and it's not as clean and consistent because, the way that Designer is set up could change or break time, run over run. And this is a way to say, I want this ODP and I want to create an NSF the same way every time. And then it does provide some support for working with ODP projects and IDEs. So this is what I'll get to later. This will be the fourth component I talk about. Now I want to start with a brief aside talking about Maven. So if you've attended any of my presentations at CollabSphere or elsewhere in the past, I pretty much always mention Maven at some point. It's just one of my things. So I do want to talk about first, it's not inherently scary. It seems like that, but just look how cute this owl is. Like, this is not a scary owl. Maven does not have to be terrifying. Like the way that we've gotten into it as Domino developers a lot of the time is very intimidating and very prone to breaking, but it doesn't necessarily need to be very scary at its core. All it really is a tool used for build automation. So again, this build automation term is I have some source code and I want to get some binary out of it, whether it's a C program or a Java program, or in this case, an NSF. I just have source and I want to have it consistently turned into a result. That's build automation, and that's what Maven is at its core. It's primarily used for Java projects, but it's adaptable to many things. So, its initial use is I just want to have Java code and compile it into a jar, but it can be used for any number of languages. There are all sorts of integrations, and the NSF ODP tooling is one of those. So it takes a standard style Maven project and lets you work with an NSF, or create an NSF rather. If you see a pom.xml file, that's your giveaway for Maven. So if you look at a GitHub repository and you see a pom.xml, similarly, there's build.gradle, that means Gradle. Here, pom.xml means this is a Maven project. So that's you see that, you're talking about Maven. And I use it here because it allows for this cleanly reproducible builds across systems without environment-specific details. So what this means is that, for example, when we first started the OpenNTF Domino API years and years and years ago, we were all working with Eclipse, and we shared these as Eclipse projects. But then what would happen is that I would get a change from one of the other contributors, and it would break because it was referring to a Java VM on some other part, like on their system, and it wouldn't be present on mine, or some other little local configuration thing. And one of the ideas of Maven is to reduce that dramatically, where you say, look, figure all this out based on what your system is, only have the stuff that matters. So that's one of the clean and reproducible aspects of it, where it adapts to your environment and doesn't require you to have very fiddly setup. And another bit of an aside, complexity. So I put this in here because when I've talked about the NSF ODP tooling, I found that I have a tendency to come off starting with the really high-end stuff, where let's say you have thousands of NSFs or plugins or whatever. It doesn't have to be that. And when I talk about Maven, that brings up things like command line knowledge. So like, will using this require a lot of command line knowledge? Not really. In theory, all of the stuff I'm talking about can be done from Eclipse in the IDE, and even in the stuff that is done from the command line is not particularly onerous. And that said, I strongly encourage you, if you haven't done a lot of time in with particularly a Unix style command line like on Mac OS or Linux, or the subsystem for Linux on Windows, I encourage you. It's very handy, but is not particularly obligatory here. Will this require lots of complicated XML configuration? Only kind of. So the pom.xml is XML configuration, but as in an example project I have on the repository, once you have a file that does this, it's not that complicated from then on. A lot of the XML complexity that came with Maven had to do with the more complicated variants of projects, whereas this is not inherently that. If you want to make it complicated, you can. There may be reasons why you do, but it's not as complicated as it may seem. And importantly, and this one will go out to people who are, single developers working on an NSF that's not an XPages application. Will this complicate my day-to-day development experience, which is a big one with this? And that's only if you wanted to. So the core of it is that if you want to work with Designer and have it sync to the ODP, and then you just use this tool to have a way to compile it outside of Designer, your workflow doesn't change. If you then say, I want to have a bunch of OSGi plugins and other related NSFs and extra, compiling NPM projects, you can make it very complex and very complicated, but you don't have to. So now I'm going to start diving into the meat of it. So the ODP compiler, this is the one that started it all out. So this is what takes an NSF ODP and creates an NSF. This was, for a little bit of background of it, this originated because for one of my clients, we have a bunch of NSFs that we were working with, and we would keep the on-disk projects in source control because there were a couple of us working on it. But then eventually at some point, we would have to make a build for our client to deploy onto their servers. And the process for that was that I or one of the other people, but usually me, would go into Designer, go to the, open the database, do application new copy, make sure I have the target right, the file system location right, make sure I don't have local encryption on, and do this copy, hope that there wasn't any weird residue in Eclipse. And so I decided after a good while of that, I said, I never want to do this again. So I'm going to write a plugin to handle this entire process for me. So this does that process of, you have an on-disk project and you want to create a new clean NSF. It allows the use of Maven and OSGi dependencies. So again, in this case, this happens to be a very complicated XPages project, and we have XPages, we have OSGi plugins, and it allows the use of that. It does not require the use of that. So if you are not using XPages, or you are not using your own or third-party XPages libraries, you don't have to, but it does allow for that. So this is meant to scale from a very simple NSF, could just be Lotus script, all the way up to NSFs that have, multiple third-party dependencies and have assumptions about what goes on the server and all this stuff. It has some niceties when it comes to XPages. It allows you to dynamically enable production XPages settings like resource aggregation. So for example, during development, for those doing XPages development, you might want to turn off resource aggregation, and you might want to say use the uncompressed versions of libraries, so that way when you get a stack trace from Dojo, which you will, it will be more readable than the really super compressed thing, and you can't read it properly. So the idea here is much like in kind of like a real development tool chain. You can work with a development version, and then when you go to build, it will turn on all those production options for you. It also allows applying a template name and version and build timestamp. So this is the, this is the old style dollar template build shared field that's been in notes for, I don't know, probably about as long as I've been alive. And so, it allows doing this. So you can say out, this is the template name, and then it will stamp it saying it was built at this time. The version comes from Maven. And then that way you have this kind of very consistent thing and say, this is this version of that template, rather than having to go in and manually modify it, or I used to have an agent that would update that field. So now this will automatically do all that for you. So a quick video of of this in action. So I have the project, and I have my command line, and I say package, which is Maven parlance for building it. And then you can see it churns for a couple seconds, and then there you go. you have an NSF. So this is the core of what the ODP compiler is, where you have your ODP project, exactly the same thing as you have in Designer. I point Designer to this when I'm working with it, and then from the command line with no special anything, it will turn that into an NSF, and then you have a nicely, it has the version in the name there, it has the version in the template, and then it just handles all of that for you. And the configuration, as I mentioned, can get more complex, but here it's going to usually look like something like this, where you say, if you're familiar with Maven configurations, this should be extremely parsable to you. If you're not, take my word for it that this is a comparatively simple Maven configuration, where you'd say, I want to include an update site, say this is the OSGi libraries I built, and I want to name it example project, so that when it's visible in notes, it will say, the template name is example project, and it was built at this date and time with this version. So this compiler can be part of a standalone project. It could be standalone or part of a larger project tree. So for example, here, I have it pairing with Tycho, which is the OSGi compilation toolset for Maven. So this is one of the examples in the repository where it builds the plugins, the XPages library, and then that's used in the NSF, and then it all ends up as part of this distribution project at the end. So I can hand off, I can run the build, and then have ready for my client a zip file that has the update site. It has any legal stuff that I need in there, and it has the NSF, and then that's ready for just deployment onto the server. And this happens consistently every time. So the basic configuration is simple. You put your ODP in an ODP directory and add a pom.xml file above it. So this is from the sample that's online. All you do is, if you're using team development in Designer now, you would just, you'd put that thing that you're syncing into an ODP subfolder, and then have this one POM file above it, and then that will enable you to build the project outside of Designer. You can also continue to build it in Designer as usual. So it's meant to be take something that already exists with nothing special and then add a little wrapper around it. So this allows a little bit of configuration while you're compiling it too, which is something that you don't necessarily get out of Designer. So as I showed earlier, you have update site references for OSGi plugins. You can point to class path jars and Maven dependencies. So, for example, a lot of the time in NSF, like for example, if you had deployed to JVM, libExt, or other libraries, those are not OSGi plugins, but this will allow you to still compile the Java that's in your XPages project. This doesn't apply to Java agents, which are kind of their own bundled up thing and still, do their own thing. But for XPages projects, it allows you these kind of multiple ways to get Java code on your server. You can override the ODP's ACL on the fly. So for example, if your ACL just has your developers in it and it's just meant for like, this is for our development environment, you can change it so that it'll say, okay, well, in the pom.xml, you'd say, I want local domain admins, I want local domain servers, and I want whatever our company's rules are for all of this and all that setting. That way you can have that in the pom.xml and not have to worry about, does Joe Schmo's local development NSF have a different ACL than what we want? You can have that consistent no matter what each individual developer is doing. And then again, add a template name and version on the fly. And then one that ended up fun in at least one case is that you can set the ODS level to target, because for example, if you're compiling with an environment that's set to generate R10 databases, or I don't think there's an R11 flag yet, but maybe, but then you want to deploy it to an like a 901 server or what have you, you'll probably want to backport the ODS a little bit. You can set this back all the way to whatever the .ns number file sequence is. So .ns1 probably would work. So you can that way target older servers even if your development environment is newer. So to talk about the exporter portion a little bit. This is what takes the NSF and creates an ODP. So this is the other part of it. So you take the ODP, put it into an NSF, and vice versa. So this is replicating the full chain of behavior from Designer's source control support. It's not incremental, at least not yet. So for example, in Designer, if you have an NSF associated with an on-disk project and you change a form, it will automatically just sync that one form and that will show up. Here, you'd rerun the entire export and it would overwrite it. You would end up seeing just that form change, but it's not an automatic thing sitting there in the same way. I am considering that, but it's not there yet. This can be used to export a local NSF file or a remote database. For example, I use it in this way in my IP management role, where I download a project and it's an NSF, and I can say, well, just export this into an ODP so I can point my IP management tools at it and deal with it in a much nicer way. So I also use this as part of my client projects where I point it at the ODPs on a server and it will bring all of them down, or NSFs on a server, and it will bring all of them down. It has a nice benefit in that it automatically applies swiper cleanup to exported DXL. If you're using team development in Designer and you're not using the swiper project from OpenNTF, I suggest you change your ways and adopt it. It cleans up the DXL nicely so that you end up with, it'll have fewer weird little things that don't actually need to be committed to the repository, and it just makes things look and work a lot more nicely. So here's it in action. Once again, this is from the command line and showing, hey, I want to pull this database from a server. So this happens to be my blog's data. So it has a bunch of views and things in there. And then there it creates an ODP. So this is exactly like what you would get out of Designer, or at least it's intended to be. And so it has all the views and it has all the XPages and it has any agents or forms and all of that stuff in there. So it brings it out in the same way that Designer would. So this can be used in lieu of Designer's export sync. It's less convenient, but it's also less fault prone. I know that when we were using Designer's export sync as the main thing, what would happen a lot of the time is that Designer wouldn't notice that a file was changed, like a design element was changed, and wouldn't export it. So we would create a new copy of the database, say, here you go, client, deploy this, and then they would deploy it, and they would say, I thought you did what I asked you to do. And I'd say, yes, I did, but Designer didn't notice that I did. With this tool, it will just do it fully clean every time, and you won't have that particular issue. It's very useful when someone on your team doesn't use source control. So with my client, most of the team is on board with this, but then we have one or two developers that are, we'll say they've been doing notes development for a long time, and they are not necessarily on board with using source control. And so they will just make changes. They won't tell anybody about it. And so I have a script that periodically goes through all of those afflicted databases and re-exports everything, saying, oh, look, it looks like somebody made some changes to these. This is useful to convert NSFs to a processable text form. Like I was saying, this is exactly what I do with when I'm doing IP checks for OpenNTF. So, this outside of source control, this has some potential other uses, like if you're scanning through, or if you just want to get image resources out, or what have you. The next component is NSF deployment. So this is something that deploys a compiled NSF to a server, optionally replacing an existing NSF's design. So this is the equivalent of the file application replace design step. It allows you to sign the database as the server. So for example, a given developer may or may not have rights to run XPages on a server. I mean, it matters actually, or run forms and whatnot in the notes client. So if you want to make sure it has a consistent signer for ECL and execution purposes, then you can have it sign the database as the server. And so this is what provides for the continuous deployment to a staging server. So this is the CD part of CI/CD. So I have, well, actually, I don't use quite this in this case, but the idea here is that you would be able to say at the, if you have this automated build, or manually or automated, you could have it build and then deploy it to a staging server. I say staging server, like this could deploy to a production server. You probably shouldn't do that. I know that notes developers enjoy just editing things on production, but we need to stop. So I'll say staging server and pretend that Domino shops have staging servers. This component, admittedly, is effectively beta. Part of the problem is that there's not a good call for doing this outside of the server tasks. So this is not quite as baked as some of the other parts, but some people have been using it successfully. It does work, but there's some rough edges that I would like to even out. So here I show taking a database that I've compiled, I deploy it to a server, and then it didn't exist, and now it does. So this is something where, again, this is happening all just, no designer, no notes client open, any of this. And it deploys it out to the server. If I had made a change, I could update it and deploy it back out. So about the Eclipse UI extensions. So it does a couple of things. So One thing is that it gives you these nice little pretty pictures on the screen, but it configures the Java class path. So for example, if you have a project in, if you have your NSF in Designer, it will know about Java classes on the file system, but also know about the XPages classes and any OSGi dependencies or other, like a jar that you have in the NSF. And this will configure it in the same way so that if you're using Eclipse, you will be able to edit Java in, conceptually the same way, but functionally a better way than you do in Designer. So this includes OSGi dependencies. It also adds categories for design elements with nice little pictures from the Tango project. So I made this so that it's meant to mirror what you get in Designer. So that one was just because I thought it looked nice. It adds DXL autocomplete via the schema files. So this is, when I say schema files, I'm referring to files that come with Notes and Domino, and they allow you to say when you have, for example, a view DXL file, it knows that you can do columns, but you can't just make up your own tag, and it will do autocomplete and things like that. To whoever at HCL maintains those, thank you. I don't know how many other people use them, but I do, and I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate that the license for them is extremely liberal. It's great. So Eclipse extension wise, so why this is useful in Eclipse, I had mentioned the Java class path. This allows you to change, refactor code across both your plugins and the NSF. So this is an example, a case where, for example, you have a class that's in your XPages library, and then you reference it in Java in your NSF, and then you change the name of the class, or you add a new class, or you change a method signature or something, and then that normally won't be visible in the NSF until you deploy it, and then it says, oh, I can't find this class, or I can't find this method. And then you have to install the plugin into Designer, restart Designer, reopen the project, and then see where the errors are. The way this will work is that if you have something in your plugin and also in the NSF in Eclipse, it will handle all of that for you. It will say, oh, this class in the NSF references this class in the plugin. I will take care of everything. I will make all of these changes. So this has saved me no small amount of headache. I mentioned it has code autocomplete here. So you can see that, for example, you start typing XPages code and it says, oh, I know that text is a thing, input text is a thing. It brings descriptions in. It knows that you can do value. It knows all this stuff. So it's not exactly what you get out of Designer, but it's a little more reliable usually. And so the idea here is that when you're editing XPages code or DXL for design elements, you do get assistance from the environment. So it's meant to be like the kind of thing you get in the XPages editor, but again, a little more reliable. Now, I've talked about the individual components, and so I want to talk about different workflows. So this is something that's come up when I've realized, like, trying to talk about, like, why would you use this? So, like, the fact that these things exist, why is that interesting? Like, as a developer, as a part of a team, as a solo developer, why is any of this important? So things that are generally applicable to all of the scenarios I'm going to talk about. One of them is that it changes the way that you conceptually think about the notes development as the ODP becomes the source of truth, which is, it's a term in various things, but the idea here is that rather than the ODP being like a side effect of when you do team development sync in Designer, it becomes like that's the real version, and then you can compile it down to an NSF, but that only really exists as a development area or deployable build. This is, kind of a technical thing, but it's actually largely a conceptual thing where you start thinking the NSF I'm working with, this is just, like if you were doing a mobile app and you deployed a development build to your phone, like that development build is not the app, your code is the app. Similarly, the ODP is the app, and then the NSF happens to be something that you're working with. And then using this, like, kind of codifies that in your mind, and it's actually been just conceptually useful to me, and I think that in another couple of cases I've seen that. The build process, versions, and timestamps in NSFs. So rather than being like, this is the NSF and everybody point to this, this is a build of the NSF or an NTF, however you name it. And then this is the build at this time. So if you give it to the client and then you say, okay, what version are you using? It's not, well, what version did you live edit on my server? It's, I have this build with this version number on it, this timestamp. The build process is consistent every time. So this is, I've been hammering away at this a little bit, but the idea is that rather than all of the weird edge cases in Designer and human error, this will be the same thing every time. If you do a clean package in Maven, it will clean out the old NSF, create a new one, and it does it the same way, start to finish every single time. You get clean NSF output, no unintended residue like extra documents sitting around in there, or anything that was not meant to be in there. There's no copy application misclicks. I know I did this a number of times where like I'd type the wrong name or overwrite the wrong NSF or what have you. Just like going through a manual process in a user interface is very fault prone for a fragile human like we generally are. So talking about the first scenario, so this is single developer, simple NSF. So this is the one that generally when I talk about the NSF ODP tooling, it seems like this is not talking to this kind of developer, but it is. So beyond the generally applicable things, this gives you, it keeps your focus on good source control habits. So whenever I work on almost anything, I start with a Git repository, whether this is an NSF or a Java project or a JavaScript thing just for fun, or if it's for client or for an open source project. I focus around making sure I have everything in source control. I have my main and develop branches, I check things in, I do all this, and then using the NSF ODP tooling really helps focus on that rather than, kind of the fast and loose note style of, oh, there's a problem, I'll just go to production, change it, and then maybe I'll put a comment saying I changed this at this time. That sucks. It works technically, but it sucks. And so this helps you focus on do this first. It's kind of, it's a constraint that is liberating. In this case, I mentioned Maven configuration is very small. If you're not doing OSGi stuff, if you're not doing weird Java dependencies, the Maven configuration is very simple. There's a single NSF example in the repository on GitHub. And then all you have is this one file that you're not really going to change ever. And then you have your ODP inside it. So you don't, it's not one of those things where you have a massive wall of impenetrable text and somebody says, oh, go change this version to this, do this little thing. It's meant to be very simple and very straightforward. This is also potentially a good way to dip into Jenkins. So Jenkins, if you're not familiar with it, is it's an automated build system. So this is something that you run on a server, and it will, for example, look or get notified when there's a change to one of your repositories. So you push up code, Jenkins sees that, it starts building it, and then it spits out the NSF at the end. This is useful for, this is generally, a lot of the times it's a large team where you have a bunch of people, so you can see who broke the build, who's working on this, so you don't have a single person doing all of it. But this is also just useful for a single person. Like I have projects where I'm the only person working on it, and I have it set up on Jenkins so that way I know if there's a problem, I'll get an email saying the build failed. And I also know it will deploy it out. If it's an OSGi thing, it'll deploy it out to an update site for me. So this is a good way. I have a blog post recently talking about how to set this up. This is a good way to dip your toes into that. And then similarly with the similar to the keeping focus on good source control habits, it encourages versioning and discourages the shoot from the hip development. So rather than saying, the NSF is whatever it is now, you'll say this is version 1.0.1 of the NSF. This is 1.0.2 of the NSF. And these are the changes. You can see them in source control. You can have these versions. It will see when it was built. You don't technically have to do all of this. You don't have to have good habits, but this encourages good habits. And importantly, it works with classic design elements, XPages or no. So I know that generally if I'm speaking about something, XPages and Java enter into it, but you don't need to use that at all. You could have a frameset-based, navigator-based forms and views app from 1999, and it will work with the NSF ODP tooling. And potentially it'll be a lot easier to do that than if you were working with XPages. Now, the other case, this is essentially one of my main clients, multi-person team, XPages libraries. Maven makes the OSGi bundle build process more consistent. So this is something where if you've done Maven with OSGi, you've encountered Tycho, and it makes all of that stuff more consistent for you because that, much like dealing with Designer, if you deal with Eclipse without Maven, it has its own kind of weird ways of doing things. one nicety is that any team maker can make a full build. Any team member can make a full build. So this is an example where a lot of the times, if you have a bunch of libraries and a bunch of NSFs, there might be one person who kind of like by default is the one that is essentially the build master, because only they know where to put all the stuff and how to create the distribution and all that sort of thing. But here, the person that knows how to do this is Maven. It handles this stuff for you. Now, the Eclipse support, again, allows Java refactoring. So this is something where, we do this all the time with my client, where we will change things in the plugin and have that change reflected in the NSF. This takes away a lot of the potential trouble there. And the XSP editing allows at least some tasks to be done fully outside Designer. And in fact, with some of my other projects, when I'm doing XPages development nowadays, I very rarely use Designer for it at all. Now, another case, a team with uncooperative members. So if not everyone is on board, say you're the only one doing this, or 2 out of 3 of you are doing this, for example, you can use the exporter to make ODP snapshots. So this is, again, ODP becomes the source of truth, even if the other team member was just updating things willy-nilly and not telling you. In my case, I have a script I run periodically that exports a bunch of NSFs to ODP. So I have something that I say, okay, run this, I look through, and then I go in and get and see, okay, these are all the things that changed, check these in, and then I just have a commit that says, okay, these are the ODP updates that happened without our knowledge. It's not the best workflow, but it's better than the old ways. So it kind of like drags a lot of that stuff in. And then another use case, kind of a newer era one, is an NPM-based App Container, which sounds crazy, but it's actually what it really means is you have a NPM-based build, so like Angular, Ionic, React, any one of these kind of like newer era JavaScript things that you would that takes its build on its own, and then you're just using the NSF as a container. So you'd put the files into web content, and then you can do this manually in Designer. You can drag them in. You can do it. There are a couple tools that will kind of help do this. You can have it synced with the NSF and then or ODP and have Designer refresh periodically. And it's okay, but it is very fault prone. And this is a way where you build your web app and then you just want to deliver it inside an NSF. You can include this as part of your full chain of build. I had a blog post a little while ago where I showed exactly this kind of thing. And then I want to talk a little bit about the assembly plugin. So this is a plugin that's standard in Maven, not particular to this, that allows you to create a full distribution zip. So we have this a lot in OpenNTF projects, and we have this in a lot of client projects where you want to end up with something that you can hand off to your client or to a user. So in this case, I gather several dozen built NSFs, a couple update sites, support libraries, instructions, legal information. This is all stuff that normally you would create a zip and then drag all the things in, make sure you have everything. But this is just something at the end of every build. It will have a zip, and I can say, here you go. Here's the new build. And I don't even have to do that anymore. I have a server that does that for me. So it's just always available. I use this on almost every one of my OpenNTF projects. It's a great way to get those license and notice files in there. And it saves your friendly IP manager some hassle when they go through and check your uploads to OpenNTF. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about Jenkins. This was probably best saved for the blog post that I reference here. I will have the slides over to Richard at some point. You can follow this link. This is a way where you can have Jenkins build all of your stuff and potentially deploy it somewhere, or at the very least, like here, I have a special web page that shows here's where you can download the latest builds from different branches. So before I go through these questions, I want to talk a little bit about potential future additions that I have. So this project is generally like it's a labor of love for me, but there are things I might want to do. People have asked, I've added those things in. Other people are welcome to contribute. It is an open source project. So I want to do some deployments or improvements to deployment. And if anybody knows the secret replace design API call that Notes uses, and like you could secretly tell me, I would be extremely happy about that, because that is a real bugbear for me. I would love to do a Docker-based build runtime. So actually next month, there's an OpenNTF webinar about Docker. If you attend that, this will make a little more sense, but this would make things even more consistent and a little more portable. I want to work against live NSF. So this is something I've been considering where just point Eclipse at Domino and work with an NSF. Basically, that would be when I finally get so sick of tired of Designer that I spend a week rewriting it myself, well, more than a week. This may happen eventually. It depends on how angry I get at Designer. Ability to edit agents in Eclipse right now, especially Java agents, they're their own special thing and it's not really supported. It's just a big DXL thing. I would love to be able to edit those. And then one of these, maybe unit tests for in NSF code. Unit tests in Domino are tough, especially outside of XPages, but even among XPages Java code, it would be great because one of the things that you can do with Maven is run tests as you build, so that way if a test fails, the build fails. I would love to be able to do that in here. So now I would like to go to questions, and I see I have a couple here, so I'll just start. I'll look through these. What are the credentials to connect to the server? So this depends on how you are doing your build. So if you're working with a local runtimes, for example, a Notes client on the Mac or a Domino server on Linux or Windows, it will be your Notes ID. So in that case, it just uses the Notes ID directly. It's a full Notes runtime. So it will be that. If you're connecting to a remote server, you would have credentials that are allowed to work on that server, and then it would be using the server's ID. So everything would be built and signed with that server's ID. Let's see. Yeah, so another, going through these questions now, classic development, forms, views, editing in Eclipse. This is actually something that I probably should have put on there. It's something I would love to have WYSIWYG designers for forms and views, things like that. Ideally, a much better view designer than what comes in Designer. I don't know that I personally will do that because it's a lot of work. That's something I may do eventually. I would love to have nicer things. There's nothing stopping that from being done. Like Eclipse has some tools for making editing of XML files with a graphical designer easier. So I've considered that kind of thing. And so maybe it's a possibility for the future. Right now you can edit it with DXL, which especially for views is actually not too bad, especially with some editing with some autocomplete in there. Next is possible to change the XSLT for Swiper. That is an open issue in the repo. I would like to be able to do that. It wouldn't be difficult. I just haven't implemented it yet. But that's certainly something that, like, yes, it will be possible. I just haven't implemented that. So probably in an upcoming version, I would like to do that. Is it true only with Java XPages we can do JUnits and code coverage quality versus LotusScript and formula language? Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, somebody could write unit testing. I mean, I think there is a like DUnit or something for LotusScript that you'd run, I guess, in Notes. I don't know. For formula language, I don't even know where you would start. Java has good tooling for this. LotusScript and formula do not. It has some a little bit, but there's a much larger community behind Java than there is for LotusScript, and that's one of the benefits. Yeah, ODP bugs, scheduled agents as an example. Currently, it doesn't deal with this is referring to the edge cases with DXL where it doesn't perfectly represent something in that is representable in the NSF. So I think scheduled agents, I think if I recall correctly, it's something where like if you started at midnight and end at midnight, it doesn't represent it, something like that. Unfortunately for that one, until HCL fixes it, I don't have a perfect representation for that because I couldn't necessarily reliably detect what you intended. For other things like form layout, things like that, in those cases, I would recommend using binary DXL format, which actually at the moment is the only fully supported way of doing those. So some of them for, rich text things, binary DXL is your answer. For some others, getting HCL to actually fix some of those long-standing bugs is your other answer. Using with GitLab. I mean, I haven't used GitLab personally. So the source control side of it is just source control, so it's not dependent on any given source control environment. Running on a scheduled basis. One of the gotchas with any kind of like CI tool like Jenkins or others is that your server has to know how to build it. So either a remote runtime or running it locally. So if it's a hosted thing, you would have to point at a server you run to do the compilation part. It would work. And then that would require nothing special on the server, but you still would need to have that in there. Yep. Justin from Pominic mentions they are working on the on GUI builders. So fortunately, that is my hope that they will do all of the work for me, because I don't want to, but I would like to see it done. So I am more than happy to let them do it. Let's see. Yeah. So right. Oh, so there is one thing that comes. Justin was also asking about update sites. So if you're doing XPages development and you want to do update sites, which is not directly related to the NSF ODP tooling, but it is something important if you're running it locally or if you're doing development with it, is generating update sites. This is referring to the IBM, like the update site for build management that the one-time XPages team uploaded years ago that has not been officially updated. Unfortunately, that's up to HCL to update. Hopefully they will at some point, or they will allow OpenNTF to do it. I would love to do it, but I do not have legal permission. And unfortunately, as an IP manager, I can't pretend that I don't know that. So it's kind of just up to HCL to either allow that to happen or do it themselves. Let's see. Yep. Oh, and I think finally, how is Baldur's Gate 3? I've only played a little bit of it. I really like it. I love turn-based tactical RPGs. They're like, I like real-time with pause RPGs, but turn-based is just better, in my opinion. That's just the way to go. So I expect Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be amazing. I love Larian, and I love turn-based RPGs. So I think that covers it, which is good because I am 30 seconds over time. So I don't know if we're going to get kicked out at any point before the next presentation, but thank you everybody for attending.
Hey, Jesse.
Yes.
Jesse, there is one more that came into the chat.
Oh, about how this compares with Darwino, if at all. So Darwino is another project that I've worked on. It does not compare. They solve different needs in a lot of ways. So hypothetically, one could have a project that uses, and actually one of my clients does use both, but they cover very different things. So this is for if you're doing either if you're actively doing NSF-based development, XPages or otherwise, or you just have one that you're dragging along with whatever you're doing. This covers that portion. It doesn't necessarily, it could potentially help. For example, if you wanted to, one thing that I've toyed with is the notion of transforming an XPages application into a Java EE application. This could help with that because it has some knowledge of it, but they're not related as a real thing. It's just more of a maybe, but not. They're not technically related anyway.
Okay, and there's one more. We can do that one real quick.
Am I trying to save XPages? No one can save XPages, honestly. But we have a lot of XPages code, and we got to do something with it. There's a lot of XSP markup out there, and this is a way that you continue working with it. I could, if I had 5 more hours, I could fill them all up talking about XPages. But a lot of us have active XPages projects, either that are still being built or have been built or that we're tweaking. We got to do something with it, and this allows that XPages stuff. Personally, when I can use other technologies like JSP or JSF or JAX-RS with actually with some of my clients, we do things where new components use REST services only and are just in iframes in an XPage. It's not XPages anymore. So I am not trying to save XPages at this point. But it's also not a competition between the two. This is more about if you have these problems to solve, which I think a lot of us do, XPages or otherwise, this will help you there.
Great.
All right.
All right. Well, you are the host, so you can stop the meeting. You're allowed to end it. Okay. But thank you very much. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I'll see you all at the next presentations.